Jerusalem, the city where Jesus was crucified. The stone streets are slick with blood. The sound of hammers striking nails echoes off the walls as bodies writhe on wooden crosses just outside the city gate. Inside, smoke rises from the temple altar where thousands of Passover lambs are being sacrificed, their blood pooling in channels that run red toward the Kidron Valley. The air is thick, incense mixing with death, perfume blending with the stench of animals, and unwashed pilgrims cramming into every available space. This is Jerusalem during Passover week. And somewhere in this chaos, a man who claimed to be the Messiah is about to die the most shameful death the Roman Empire could devise. But here's what most people miss. Jerusalem wasn't just the backdrop for Jesus' crucifixion. It was the theological necessity. Why did Jesus have to die in this specific city? What made Jerusalem's religious, political, and architectural landscape essential to God's redemptive plan? And what does archaeology reveal about the actual Jerusalem where Jesus walked, taught, and was executed? Not the sanitized version of children's storybooks, but the violent, politically volatile, religiously intense city that Pontius Pilate governed and the Sanhedrin controlled? Stay until the end, because what we are about to discover will shatter comfortable assumptions about Jesus' final week. The historical reality of Jerusalem transforms the crucifixion from a distant religious concept into a brutal, calculated political execution that happened in a real place with real power structures, and reveals why it had to happen exactly where and how it did. To understand Jerusalem in Jesus' time, we must grasp its unique position in the ancient world. This wasn't merely another provincial city in the Roman Empire. It was the theological center of Judaism, the only place on earth where Jews believed God's presence dwelt in concentrated form. The temple wasn't just a building, it was the axis mundi, the pivot point between heaven and earth. 3 times annually, Jewish men from across the Mediterranean world were commanded to make pilgrimage here for the great festivals. During Passover, Jerusalem's normal population of 40,000 to 50,000 could swell to over 200,000. Archaeological evidence paints a vivid picture of Herodian Jerusalem. Herod the Great, who ruled from 37 to 4 BC, had transformed the city into an architectural marvel. He expanded the Temple Mount to twice its previous size, a massive platform covering 35 acres, held up by retaining walls of enormous stones, some weighing over 500 tons. The western wall still stands today, its lower courses containing stones from Herod's construction. Walking along the base of this wall, you can still see the original paving stones where Jesus himself walked, where merchants sold sacrificial animals, where pilgrims from Galilee first entered the city. The city sprawled across several hills, divided by valleys. The upper city on the western hill housed the wealthy, Herodian palaces, the homes of aristocratic priestly families, elaborate mansions with ritual baths, and beautiful mosaics. Archaeological excavations in the Jewish quarter have uncovered these elite residences. One mansion had over 600 square meters of living space, decorated with frescoes, with multiple ritual purification baths, indicating extreme concern for Levitical purity. The furniture was imported, the dishes were fine ware, the lifestyle was affluent beyond anything most Jews could imagine. Below, in the lower city, clinging to the slopes of the Tyropoeon Valley and the city of David, the poor lived in cramped, multi-story tenements. The contrast was stark and visible. You could stand in the lower city and look up at the mansions above, seeing wealth you would never attain. The smell would have been overwhelming in these crowded neighborhoods, cooking fires, human waste, animals, the constant press of bodies in narrow alleys where sunlight barely penetrated. But Jerusalem's physical landscape was only the beginning of what made it unique. The city existed in a state of constant religious and political tension that would explode during Jesus' final week. Roman occupation was everywhere visible. The fortress Antonia, a massive military garrison, loomed directly adjacent to the Temple Mount, a deliberate statement of power. From its towers, Roman soldiers could observe everything happening in the temple courts. During festivals, When religious fervor and messianic expectation ran highest, extra troops were stationed throughout the city, ready to suppress any hint of rebellion. Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect of Judea from 26 to 36 AD, normally resided in Caesarea Maritima on the coast. But during major Jewish festivals, he came to Jerusalem with additional forces. Pilate was not the weak, hand-wringing figure of popular imagination. Historical sources, Josephus and Philo, describe him as ruthless, contemptuous of Jewish sensibilities, quick to use violence. He had massacred Galilean pilgrims whose blood mixed with their sacrifices. He had appropriated temple funds to build an aqueduct. He had brought military standards bearing Caesar's image into Jerusalem, deliberately violating Jewish law against graven images. The Jewish leadership navigated this occupation carefully. The high priest and the Sanhedrin, the council of 70 elders, held limited authority to govern religious matters and minor civil affairs, but their power depended entirely on Roman tolerance. The high priest's position was itself a Roman appointment. Caiaphas, who served from 18 to 36 AD, had survived in office longer than most, precisely because he knew how to collaborate with Rome without completely losing legitimacy with the Jewish people. It was a precarious balancing act. Appear too independent, and Rome would crush you. Appear too complicit, and your own people would reject you. And it was precisely at this point that Jesus became an intolerable problem for both powers. His popularity threatened Roman control. Any charismatic leader gathering crowds raised the specter of revolt. His teachings challenged the religious establishment's authority and their careful accommodations with Rome. When he entered Jerusalem on a donkey during Passover week, deliberately evoking Zechariah's prophecy of the coming king, both Pilate and Caiaphas would have understood this wasn't just religious theater, it was a potential spark in a powder keg. The temple itself dominated Jerusalem physically and theologically. Imagine approaching the city as a Galilean pilgrim, as Jesus and his disciples did. From the Mount of Olives, you would first see the temple rising before you, its white limestone walls gleaming in the sun, its gold-covered gate blazing, smoke from sacrifices rising continually. Josephus wrote that the temple appeared from a distance like a mountain covered with snow, and its gold ornaments caught the sun so brilliantly that viewers had to avert their eyes. The temple complex was organized in concentric zones of increasing holiness. The outer court, the court of the Gentiles, was the largest, open to everyone. This is where merchants sold sacrificial animals and currency exchangers operated, because Roman coins bearing Caesar's image couldn't be used for temple offerings. Thousands of people crowded this space, especially during festivals. The noise would have been deafening, animals bleating and lowing, merchants shouting prices, coins clinking, the babel of languages as Jews from across the diaspora gathered. When Jesus cleansed the temple, overturning the money changers' tables and driving out those selling animals, he was attacking the economic system that enriched the priestly aristocracy. These weren't small-time operators. This was big business, controlled by the family of the high priest. Archaeological evidence shows that the house of Annas, the patriarch of the high priestly family, monopolized the sale of sacrificial animals. They bought at low prices from Galilean and Judean farmers, then sold at inflated prices to pilgrims who had no choice but to purchase approved animals for their offerings. Beyond the court of the Gentiles, stone barriers marked boundaries. Gentiles could not cross on pain of death. Archaeologists have found warning inscriptions. No foreigner is to enter within the balustrade and embankment around the sanctuary. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his death, which follows. Beyond this barrier, Jewish women could enter the court of women. Jewish men could proceed to the court of Israel. Only priests entered the court of priests, where the great altar stood, where sacrifices were performed from dawn until the 9th hour every day. But there was a bigger problem lurking beneath Jerusalem's religious grandeur. The entire system had become corrupted by wealth and political compromise. Jesus wasn't the first to recognize this. The Essenes, the community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, had withdrawn to the wilderness specifically because they believed the Jerusalem priesthood was illegitimate. They called the high priests sons of darkness and awaited divine judgment on the temple establishment. Jesus' teaching struck at the heart of this corruption. When he spoke of the temple's destruction, not one stone will be left upon another, he was pronouncing judgment not just on a building, but on a religious system that had become an instrument of exploitation. The widow who gave her last 2 coins, Jesus didn't praise her devotion as much as he condemned a system that demanded her poverty while priests lived in mansions. The Pharisees who devoured widows' houses, he exposed religious hypocrisy that used piety to justify economic predation. The cleansing of the temple happened during Passover week, the most politically sensitive time of the year. Passover commemorated Israel's liberation from Egypt, and during the festival, messianic fervor reached its peak. Every year, Rome worried about riots. Every year, the Sanhedrin worked to maintain order. And here came Jesus, a Galilean prophet with a massive following, creating a disturbance in the very heart of the temple complex, challenging the authority of the high priestly families, speaking cryptically about the temple's destruction and his ability to rebuild it in 3 days. The religious authorities had to act, but they faced a dilemma. Jesus was immensely popular, especially among the Galilean pilgrims and the poor. Arresting him publicly might trigger the very riot they feared. They needed to take him quietly, at night, away from the crowds. They needed charges that would satisfy both Jewish religious concerns and Roman political interests. And they needed to move quickly before the festival ended and Jesus returned to Galilee beyond their immediate reach. And it was exactly there that Judas Iscariot's betrayal became essential. For 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave, Judas agreed to lead the temple guard to Jesus when he was away from the crowds. On Thursday night, after celebrating a Passover meal with his disciples, Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. This was a place he habitually visited, a place Judas knew he would be. The garden's location is significant. It was outside the city walls, across the Kidron Valley from the Temple Mount. In the darkness, Jesus could see the temple blazing with torchlight as priests worked through the night slaughtering Passover lambs. The irony is profound. While the sacrificial system continued inside the city, the true Passover lamb prepared himself for slaughter outside the walls. Gethsemane means oil press, a place where olives were crushed to extract oil. That night, Jesus experienced a crushing of his own will. Luke's gospel records that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground, a rare medical condition called hematidrosis that can occur under extreme psychological stress. He prayed 3 times for the cup of God's wrath to pass from him, yet submitted, "Not my will, but yours be done." The incarnate Son of God, who had walked Galilee healing the sick and teaching about the kingdom, now faced the full weight of what his mission required. When the armed crowd arrived, temple guards carrying torches and weapons, Jesus didn't resist. Peter drew a sword and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his ear, but Jesus healed the man and rebuked violence. He told his disciples, "Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the Scriptures be fulfilled?" This is crucial. Jesus went to his death voluntarily, not because he was powerless to resist, but because this was the plan from eternity. The trials that followed reveal the machinery of injustice that converged on Jesus. First, an illegal nighttime hearing before Annas, the former high priest who still wielded power behind the scenes. Then a hasty session of the Sanhedrin at Caiaphas's house, where witnesses were brought to testify against Jesus. Their testimonies didn't agree, a fatal flaw under Jewish law which required 2 consistent witnesses to convict. Finally, in desperation, Caiaphas asked directly, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" When Jesus answered, "I am," using the divine name itself, Caiaphas tore his robes and declared this blasphemy worthy of death. But here's the political calculation. The Sanhedrin didn't have authority to execute anyone. That power belonged to Rome alone. They needed Pilate to order the crucifixion, so they reframed their charge. To Pilate, they didn't emphasize blasphemy. Romans didn't care about Jewish theological disputes. Instead, they portrayed Jesus as a political revolutionary. He claimed to be a king. He opposed paying taxes to Caesar. He stirred up the people from Galilee to Jerusalem. These were charges Rome took seriously. Pilate's interaction with Jesus, recorded in John's Gospel, reveals the prefect's cynicism. "What is truth?" he asked, then proceeded to condemn a man he knew was innocent. Pilate tried to release Jesus, offering the crowd a choice between Jesus and Barabbas, a known insurrectionist and murderer. The crowd, manipulated by the chief priests, chose Barabbas. Pilate tried to satisfy them by having Jesus flogged, a brutal punishment that often killed men before they reached crucifixion. Roman flogging used a whip embedded with metal or bone fragments that tore flesh from bone, leaving victims in shock from blood loss. But the crowd, led by the religious authorities, kept demanding, "Crucify him." Pilate finally capitulated, but he posted a notice above Jesus' cross in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." The chief priests objected, asking him to change it to, "He claimed to be King of the Jews," but Pilate refused. "What I have written, I have written." Even in condemning Jesus, Pilate managed to insult the Jewish authorities, declaring their supposed king a condemned criminal. No one could predict what would come next, how the crucifixion itself would unfold. The site was called Golgotha, place of the skull, just outside Jerusalem's walls along a main road where maximum numbers of people would witness Rome's brutal justice. Archaeological evidence suggests this was near the present Church of the Holy Sepulchre, although the exact location remains debated. What we know with certainty, crucifixion was designed not just to kill, but to humiliate, to break the victim's spirit before breaking their body, to serve as public spectacle that deterred others from challenging Roman authority. Victims were stripped naked, their shame total. They were forced to carry the horizontal beam of their cross to the execution site, a beam weighing 75 to 125 pounds. Jesus, weakened by flogging and blood loss, couldn't carry his cross all the way. The soldiers conscripted a man from the crowd, Simon of Cyrene, to carry it for him. At Golgotha, they laid Jesus on the wooden beam, and Roman soldiers drove iron spikes through his wrists, not his palms, which couldn't support body weight, but through the space between the bones of the forearm near the wrist, where the nail could hold securely. Then they lifted the beam and attached it to the vertical post already standing at the site. His feet were nailed to the post, knees bent. This wasn't immediately fatal. That was the horror of crucifixion. Death came slowly, over hours or even days, as the victim fought to breathe. Suspended by their arms, they couldn't fully expand their lungs. To inhale deeply, they had to push up on the nails through their feet, causing excruciating pain. Eventually, exhaustion and suffocation killed them. Sometimes soldiers would break victims' legs to hasten death, making it impossible to push up and breathe. The physical suffering was unimaginable, but the theological significance went even deeper. In Jewish law, anyone hung on a tree was under God's curse. Deuteronomy 21:23. Paul would later write, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us." Galatians 3:13. Jesus didn't just die, he died the death of the cursed, bearing the full weight of human sin and divine judgment. Yet what seemed like the end was only the beginning of the most significant transformation in human history. Between noon and 3 in the afternoon, darkness covered the land. At 3 o'clock, the 9th hour, when the evening sacrifice began in the temple, Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He was quoting Psalm 22, a messianic psalm that begins with abandonment but ends with vindication and God's kingdom extending to all nations. Then he declared, "It is finished," not a cry of defeat but of completion. The work was done. The price was paid. At that moment, Matthew's Gospel records, the temple curtain tore from top to bottom. This wasn't a small decorative cloth. Josephus describes it as a massive tapestry, hand-woven, thick as a man's palm, requiring 300 priests to manipulate it. It separated the holy place from the most holy place, the innermost sanctuary where God's presence dwelt, which only the high priest could enter, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement. When this curtain ripped in two, the symbolism was unmistakable. The barrier between God and humanity was removed. Direct access to God's presence was now available, not through priestly mediation or animal sacrifice, but through Jesus' death. The earth shook. tombs broke open. The Roman centurion supervising the execution, a man who had overseen countless crucifixions, who had seen men die cursing and pleading, declared, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Even pagan witnesses recognized something unprecedented had occurred. Jesus' body was taken down before sunset, as Jewish law required bodies not remain on crosses during the Sabbath, especially a high Sabbath during Passover. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin who had secretly believed in Jesus, obtained permission from Pilate to take the body. He and Nicodemus, another secret follower, wrapped Jesus in linen cloths with about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, a royal burial befitting a king, and laid him in a new tomb carved from rock in a garden near Golgotha. The tomb itself tells us about Joseph's wealth. Archaeologists have found several first-century tombs in Jerusalem matching the gospel descriptions, carved into solid limestone with a low entrance, a stone channel where a large circular stone could be rolled to seal the opening. These tombs cost significant money to excavate. Poor people were buried in mass graves or simple shaft tombs. That Jesus received such a burial fulfilled Isaiah's prophecy. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, Isaiah 53:9. Pilate, prompted by the religious authorities who remembered Jesus' predictions about rising after 3 days, stationed guards at the tomb and sealed it with Rome's official seal. Breaking that seal meant death. The religious authorities thought they had finally silenced this Galilean troublemaker who had threatened their power and disrupted their carefully maintained peace with Rome. But on Sunday morning, before dawn, the earth shook again. An angel rolled away the stone, not to let Jesus out, but to let witnesses in. The tomb was empty. The grave cloths lay undisturbed, still in their wrapped position, as if the body had simply passed through them. The Roman guards fled in terror, and over the next 40 days, Jesus appeared repeatedly to his followers, to Mary Magdalene in the garden, to the disciples behind locked doors, to Thomas, who demanded physical proof, to more than 500 people at once, according to Paul's account, and finally to his disciples on the Mount of Olives before ascending to heaven. When we observe Jerusalem through the lens of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, we realize that every detail of the city's geography, politics, and religious life was woven into God's redemptive plan. The temple had to be in Jerusalem because this was where sacrifices for sin were offered, and Jesus was the final perfect sacrifice. The Roman occupation had to be in place because crucifixion was Rome's unique contribution to human cruelty, and Gentile hands had to execute the Messiah to demonstrate that all humanity, Jew and Gentile, bore responsibility for his death. The religious establishment had to be corrupted because the Old Covenant system had to be exposed as insufficient, as something that required replacement rather than reform. Jerusalem was called the City of Peace, yet it was the site of the most violent injustice in history. The irony is profound. The place where God's presence dwelt became the place where God incarnate was rejected and killed. Yet this was always the plan. The Passover lambs being slaughtered in the temple while Jesus died outside the walls weren't a coincidence. They were a shadow of the reality being fulfilled. The blood flowing through temple channels toward the Kidron Valley met symbolically with the blood flowing from Jesus' wounds in the same valley. And here's the transformative truth. Because Jesus died and rose in Jerusalem, this city that had been the center of one nation's covenant with God became the launching point for a global message of reconciliation. On Pentecost, 50 days after Jesus' resurrection, the Holy Spirit fell on 120 disciples gathered in Jerusalem. They poured into the streets speaking in languages they'd never learned, and 3,000 people from nations across the known world believed and were baptized in one day. The movement that began with a crucified carpenter from Nazareth exploded from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. The same God who orchestrated Jesus' death in Jerusalem continues to work through what the world considers foolishness and weakness. Paul wrote, "Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God." 1 Corinthians 1:22-24. The crucifixion was the ultimate demonstration of this principle. The religious authorities thought they were protecting their position. Pilate thought he was maintaining order. The crowds thought they were rejecting a false Messiah, but God was accomplishing salvation for the world through their very opposition. The worst thing humans could do, murder the sinless Son of God, became the means of redemption. The cursed death on a cross became the path to resurrection glory. The shameful execution outside Jerusalem's walls became the victory that shattered death's power forever. And if this documentary strengthened your faith or gave you new understanding of Jesus' final week, I ask you to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and leave a comment about what impacted you most. Your engagement helps us continue producing content that explores biblical truth with historical depth and spiritual power. Remember that the Jesus who died in Jerusalem is alive today. He still bears the scars of his crucifixion. Thomas touched them, and John saw them in his revelation vision of the risen Christ. Those scars are permanent reminders of the price of our redemption, but they're scars on a living, glorified body. The tomb in Jerusalem is empty, and because it's empty, death has no final power over anyone who trusts in him. May the story of Jerusalem remind you that God works through the darkest moments of injustice and suffering to accomplish his purposes of redemption. What looks like defeat in human eyes is often victory in God's plan. And may you find courage in knowing that the same power that raised Jesus from death in Jerusalem is available to transform your life today, to raise you from spiritual death, to give you hope in the midst of suffering, to assure you that God's love is stronger than any force that opposes it. Until the next video, and may God bless you.